Diane was an ordained Disciples of Christ minister. She joined our church, a United Church of Christ, because we have a mutual recognition of credentials. Years ago, we began having conversation with disciples, hoping that it would lead us to an organic union, otherwise known as merger. Our mission boards cooperate. We share so many staff people, ministries. We have a similar vision, but there were bits and pieces that were hard for many people to overcome. That's what happens when change is at people's door. They kind of hold back. And so what we have kind of decided, without saying so, is we decided to do the contemporary thing. And that is that we did not get married, but we're living together. Diane joined our church because she had trouble finding a progressive congregation that reflected her deepest roots and values. People thought Diane strange. She never met a protest that she didn't like or want to be at. That wasn't the strange part. It was that she seemed so even-tempered, so void of the anger that oftentimes drives some of us into the streets. She had a mild way about it, but with very strong opinions. Deep conscience about social issues. On the other hand, she could be incredibly disarming. She had a wonderful smile, and she did the best turtle imitation I've ever seen anybody do. You would just fall out of the seats laughing. You know, it was amazing. And for just a minute, you forgot how much fire was in this person's belly. When I think of Diane, I often wonder if Jesus were alive and with us and teaching today, if Diane would be in Jesus' mind when Jesus was talking about this third beatitude. Blessed are the meek. Luke doesn't refer to meek really in the Sermon on the Plain, as we sometimes refer to Luke's version. Maybe Matthew adds it as a commentary on the first two Beatitudes we've been talking about. The listeners, however, would have easily gotten it because Matthew, you may remember, was writing to the predominantly Jewish community. And so when Jesus is set teaching these Jews out on the mount, their mind, when they heard these words, would have gone instantly to that song, Psalm 37, that Linda read. Because it talks about, in a much more expanded way, what Jesus was saying in a sentence. Blessed are the meek. They are going to inherit the earth. And we gasp, the meek. How could that possibly be? Again, Jesus startles us. The Beatitudes startle us with their implications. The Hebrew word for the meek is Elohim. Those with gentle spirits. Those who deal with others in gentle ways. Verse 11 was a promise that those who were tenant farmers would clearly understand. Those who were the small plot owners would really understand that eventually, as God's purposes were being worked out, they would get their fair share of land. The meek shall come to possess the whole of the land. Now, Luke said nothing about the meek, but Luke didn't have to. For those of you who have heard the Advent passages preached in that A, B, and C cycle, you know that sooner or later you're going to come across Mary's Magnificat. That's what we call it anyway. And Mary's Magnificat, that people sit back and cringe as they listen to it, well, unless it's set to the right music. We have that wonderful singing of Mary as she glorifies God and talks about the great turnover that will happen eventually as God's work is fleshed out. She says, God has looked upon me in my lowliness. And then as she gets toward the end, she says, and fills the starving with good things. So Luke's already declared what Jesus is about. Luke's already come out of the gate trying to say this one who's going to be born is going to be trouble. And sometimes good news is trouble. This is the word for Elohim. Mary and Joseph were part of the Elohim. We sometimes forget that, don't we? For instance, when they took Jesus for the presentation at the temple, what is it that they took? 2 doves. 2 turtle doves to give at the temple when Jesus was presented. This was the offering taken by those who were the landless peasantry, those who were most on the edge, those who were always wondering day by day how they were going to make it. It was a designation for their social status. There's an irony here. We sometimes miss the irony. The longing of the Anoim, those who were so vulnerable, so on the edge, was to own land. Land was everything. People who came to this country through the first 100 years of our existence all wanted a piece of land. The irony about this whole thing is, apart from the Romans, apart from a few of the religious folk who had done pretty well for themselves with the temple tax, the landowners were the most hated group in Palestine by the Anoim, and yet they longed to have the land. Fascinating how that goes, isn't it? How people who are so on the edge long for something that they do not have and can never see themselves fully having. The reason this was the case, that the way people kept land, the way that they kept power, was by exploiting those who didn't. It was by exploiting the poor and the marginalized, by using their labor, the fruits of their labor, in order to increase their profits. Jesus is saying, no. It's the little ones, the Anoim, that's going to have your day. Jesus was affirming what every Jew had been taught from the time of his or her birth. The land belongs to God. That's what they learned from the creation narratives onward. The land belongs to God. In one of the creation stories, we have misread it time and again because it was convenient for us to do so. God never gave those who inherited the garden permission to simply exploit it until it could produce nothing any longer. Rather, they were called to be stewards of the garden. Stewards, to use it right and well as that which was able to sustain life. So, we're sitting here scratching our heads. I know what some of you are thinking, because I told you if I didn't do my job preaching the Beatitudes, if you didn't get offended, then I hadn't done my job. We're wondering if Jesus, at another time, long before this one, was declaring some kind of class warfare. And I would say to you, no. Jesus was way beyond that. The undercurrent of Jesus' teaching was a reminder that God has little patience with basic human injustices. And those Anoim, those who were the meek, must live with the awareness that they are cherished by God and part of God's vision. A vision laced always with mercy and justice. The meek, in Jesus' mind, those who clearly understood their role in God's order, the meek were the ones in Jesus' mind who got it. The meek were those that the psalmist apparently understood hundreds of years earlier were the ones who got it. They weren't the ones who needed to prove themselves over and over again. Rather, they were the ones who got it and were able to live into that vision with some level of patience. Not without anger and frustration at the injustice. But they were able to live into that because they understood that it was God who was in control, something that people in power had difficulty understanding. We're going to eventually get, of course, to Blessed are the Peacemakers, because then we're going to talk about the Romans. And we're going to talk about all the Romans who came after the Romans, who presume that if you provide enough force, you can control things whether God wants you to or not. No. The Anoim, the meek, they are the ones who truly understand what God wants to have happen, and knowing that they have a place in that creation. It's not a matter of giving themselves and blessing injustice. It's not a matter of saying, yes, I'm poor, go ahead and dump on me some more. No. It is a matter of understanding that ultimately God will have God's way, and there's nobody who can ultimately stop that. And so when Jesus says, blessed are the meek, those who were gathered around him, they must have been kind of, whoa, because see, they were the ones who were hearing themselves in the teachings. Blessed are the meek. We tend to think of the meek as, sadly, the pathetic. Those for whom we feel sorry. For those who might twink our conscience just enough to throw a few extra bucks into the Salvation Army collection plate. Because after all, isn't that what they do, deal with the meek? No. The meek are amongst us. We live day by day interacting with them. We sometimes overlook them. We sometimes demean them. We sometimes even exploit and mistreat them. But Jesus says it's these folk, these, who will, you know what's coming, you heard it, inherit the earth. So when you leave here today, ask yourselves what I'll be asking myself as I was preparing the sermon. How do I really feel about Jesus' teachings? Maybe I'm one of those who doesn't walk away feeling all that smug and comfortable and secure, maybe I'm one of those who needs to spend more time paying attention to the meek, the humble, those for whom God cares. What will you think? Well,